Hey, what's up, friends? Grant Baldwin here. Welcome back to the Speaker Lab podcast. Thanks for joining us today. Hey, super excited. I got my friend Hal Elrod hanging out with us. You may be familiar with Hal for his story and the bajillion books that he sold, and then also his speaking story, which we're going to talk about some today as well. So, Hal, thanks for joining us, man.
Grant, first thing that caught my attention is that you talk as fast as I do, which is great. So this is going to be, we're going to record a 60-minute podcast in 30
Hmm.
minutes right now, which, and the cool part is people don't have to push that button to listen to it at like
Yes.
1.5 or 2x speed. Regular speed is fine. You'll be good to go and get this done.
This I've had people tell me that normally when they listen to podcasts, they listen at 1.5, 2
Yep.
times. That's what I do. I listen to one
Me
and a half,
too.
2 times speed, and people have said like, "Hey, you're one of the few podcasts I have to listen to at normal speed because I
Yeah.
can't keep up at 1.5, 2." So I don't know if that's a compliment for both of us or what to
Yeah.
make of that.
No,
We're efficient. That's what it is.
yeah, it's a passive aggressive insult.
Exactly. All right. So first of all, for context, again, we're going to dig into your speaking journey. But for context, you've lived a lot of life, and I know in talking with you a little bit offline before, we've kind of jokingly referenced that you've lived a life that some speakers would love to have in terms of just your story of like, oh man, look at all this amazing overcoming obstacles.
Yeah.
This guy wins the gold medal for that. So for people who aren't familiar, why don't you give us kind of a couple minute version of what all life has thrown at you over the past several years?
Yeah. So when I was 8 years old, my sister Amory died in front of me. She was a year and a half. And I woke up on a Saturday morning and my mother was giving her mouth to mouth resuscitation, CPR, pushing on her little tiny 18-month-old chest. And she died that morning. And so that was kind of the first adversity I experienced. But really, more so at 8 years old, I didn't. I didn't know how to process it. And it was seeing my mom and dad, where within 6 months of my sister's passing, my mother was leading a support group to help other parents who had lost children. And then my dad was leading a fundraiser to raise money for the hospital that tried to save my sister's life. And so it was like turning your pain into purpose. And so I was fortunate to really have that seed planted at a really young age. And then you fast forward 12 years later, I was driving home from a Cutco cutlery conference where I had just given a speech. That was my speaking career kind of started because I was selling a lot of Cutco knives, and my manager and kept saying, "Hey, we want you to speak at the division meeting and the national meeting and this and that." But driving home after one of my speeches, I was hit head on by a drunk driver at 70 miles per hour. My car was crushed by a second vehicle that hit me, that broadsided me in my driver's side door, and I was found dead at the scene. I broke 11 bones in that moment. I was clinically dead for 6 minutes and came out of a coma to be told I would never walk again. And when I came out of the coma, I told my dad, I've wanted to be a motivational speaker, ever since I started speaking at Cutco events a year and a half ago. And I never really had much to talk about. I've had a pretty normal life, and but maybe that's why this happened. Maybe I'm supposed to overcome this so I can share it with other people. And right, little did I know how true that statement would become. And then you fast forward 8 more years, 9 more years, the 2008 recession hit, and I lost over half of my income. I lost my house, foreclosed on by the bank. I went deep into debt. My credit went from 800 to 500. I got really depressed, and I created this thing called the Miracle Morning to turn my life around. And that now is, my life's work. It became a book. And then last but not least, at age 37, I'm 44 now, so about 7 years ago, I woke up in the middle of the night struggling to breathe. And a week later, they found out my lungs were failing, my heart was failing, and my kidneys were failing because I had a very rare aggressive form of cancer called acute lymphoblastic leukemia that shuts your organs down. And then I would begin the most difficult time in my life, going through 700 hours of chemotherapy, which is like 10 times the norm. It's just because my cancer was so intense. They hit it really hard with this chemo. And that led to brain issues and stuff that I'm still dealing with today and trying to figure it out. And along the way, it's like, how can I turn my pain into purpose and share my experience, my adversity, and how I overcame it, each of these, with other people to help them and empower them to overcome theirs.
I remember like when I got started speaking, and I think maybe even I need to look back in the archives there. I think maybe you and I even connected in the early days
I think so.
of just kind of exchanging some notes of like, hey man, how do we do this? What are we doing here?
Yeah.
But I remember early on just thinking like, well, in order to be a speaker, you have to have overcome some type of of obstacle, and you have to have some type of crazy story. Like I remember, I don't know if you know Josh Sundquist, who's a great speaker,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
his story was like he had cancer as a child, had a leg amputated, went on to become a one-legged skier in the downhill Olympics.
yeah.
And I'm just like, wow, I can't compete with that. Like I'm just a normal dude from the Midwest who's had like a normal average life. So when I hear, Josh's story or your story, and other people who may be watching or listening are going like, I have nothing even remotely. Like I got a hangnail once and a splinter. And like, that's kind of the extent of the physical trauma that I've dealt with. So do you feel like in order to be a successful speaker that you have to have had some type of crazy life story like what you've experienced?
Yeah, it's a really great limiting belief that speakers have, because no, the here's the thing: it's a category of speaker, right?
Mm,
In fact, I often say that I wish in a perfect world, I wish that I'd be speaking to you right now because I figured out how to create a multi-million-dollar business and the iPhone and like whatever, right? Like I wish that's what I was talking to you about.
yeah.
And so to me, there are categories of speakers, right? One is you've gone through this extraordinary adversity, you overcame it, right? Like Josh Sundquist or now Nick Santanastasso, who has no limbs. Roger Crawford is somebody I met on my way up who, has had no limbs and became a tennis player, right? So that's one category of speaker. Another category is the one I just mentioned, which is like, become really successful and then teach other people that want to be successful in doing whatever you did, right? You could be a successful internet marketer or a successful doctor or a successful, whatever, farmer. And then you teach other people how to do what you do, right? And another one is just where you develop a skill and then you're teaching others to do it. I think the simplest way to put it is that if you have learned something that other people want to know, if you've overcome something that other people want to overcome, or you've accomplished something that other people want to accomplish, then you can that you can get paid as whether it's a speaker, as even as a coach, right? I mean, in any different vehicles of how can I help other people get where I am. And the beauty of it is you only have to be a few steps ahead of that person. You don't have to have it all figured out. And in fact, in some ways, my story is a detriment. Like there's a pro and a con to
Yeah.
overcoming extreme adversity because people feel disconnected from it. They're like, well, like I've had people tell me multiple times after speeches, man, if I went through what you went through, I'd be as happy as you two. Or I'm like,
Mm,
no, man, you're missing the point. Like,
yeah.
the principles I just taught you are what you need to pay attention to. It doesn't. My story is just my story. So no, I think that it absolutely isn't required. And the other piece is you can just be a really good speaker, right? I don't want to forget that one. If you become really good at speaking and you really master that craft, then and you can you think about this. People, they remember not what you said, not what you did, but how you made them feel. I think Maya Angelou said that.
Right.
If you can make an audience feel something, right? Like a great comedian makes them laugh so much they want to tell all their friends. If you can make them feel inspired, if you can make them feel sad, like whatever, you can make them feel get good as a speaker and sharpen that craft. And then, you can get paid the big bucks to do it.
But it sounds like even kind of going back to what you referenced in your story there, that sounds like you were speaking before your accident. And so was at that point, I know you were doing Cutco and that's part of your backstory there. Was the goal of like, hey, I want to be a speaker, or is it just kind of like I'm just doing some stuff here and there because I've kind of been asked to in the Cutco world? Like basically, what's kind of that timeline there of you're going like, hey, at what point were you thinking, yes, I want to go all in on this thing in terms of being a speaker?
Yeah, so I started selling Cutco at 19 after my first year of college, and in my first 10 days, I broke the all-time the company record for it's called the Fast Start. It's your first 10 days selling Cutco, and I broke the Western region, so the Western half of the United States. It was the most anyone ever sold. Just an example, right? I didn't have an extraordinary story. I just sold a bunch of kitchen knives because I worked really hard. And then now they wanted me to speak at all of their events. And I started at like the office and then the division and so on and so forth. And so the thought of speaking was born then, but it didn't really, it wasn't like, for sure I'm going to do this. In fact, I had been a radio DJ all through high school and then I had started a DJ business. And so that was actually the dream. I wanted to be a nationally syndicated radio DJ. So I guess that'd be my first public, or not really public speaking, but first
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
communication experience. And I wanted to start a DJ business where I was doing weddings, and then I had other DJs working underneath me. That was the original dream. Then I find Cutco, and I'm like, ooh, I love this company, I love this product, I love my manager, and he's making great money. I want to do what he did. Then a year and a half after my Cutco experience was the car accident. And that's where like I really started, you asked the question, like, why did this happen to me? And if you're listening to this right now, odds are you've been through some sort of adversity in your life. You've had a victim mentality at times. You might have one now where you're like, probably less than most people if you're a speaker, right? Like you've overcome that. But still, I have a victim mentality sometimes where I'm like, man, this isn't fair. Why did I go through that? I didn't deserve that. And I think there's two different ways to ask the question, why did this happen to me? One is a disempowering victim mindset. Why did this happen to me? I don't deserve this. The other is, why did this happen to me? What can I learn from this? How can I grow from this? How can I help other people by overcoming the challenge I'm now facing? And that was the way I asked the question after the car accident. And by asking these empowering, generative, success-seeking questions, the answers that came up is like, ooh, maybe Hal, you've had that like little tiny thought of maybe like being a speaker someday. And it wasn't like a plan. It was just like, that'd be cool. I'm listening to Tony Robbins audios. I'm like, ooh, that's so cool. Like Tony gets paid to speak to people, And so after the car accident was when I really thought I want to do this. And so I started speaking at high school. My high school reached out to my parents and said, hey, I know it's only been a few months since the car accident, but when Hal's ready, you think he would come speak to his high school that I graduated like 2 years prior. And I was like, yeah, that'd be so cool. I get to take my Cutco speaking because that's the only place I've really spoken, and I get to try it somewhere else. So I spoke at my high school, loved it. And then I started going down the rabbit of Googling how to be a professional speaker. Now, Grant, you would have come up in the search back then but I don't think you were doing it back then.
I was searching the same thing back then.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And then that's when I came across like James Malinchak, college speaking success boot camp. I went to that. I hired him. John Vroman, our mutual friend, the founder of Front Row Dads. I invited him to join me in James's program. And then I don't even know if James is still doing it, but so this was like in 2000 and maybe 7, something like that, 8. And so oh my God, 17 years ago, man, what the heck?
Crazy.
So weird. But anyway, so I started investing in learning, and then I'm ordering every book I could find. Give Your Speech, Change the World, like every speak. So I really started to get serious about it. And then John Vroman and I joined 2 different associations for college speaking. He joined he joined APCA, Association for Professional Campus Activities. I joined NACA. And both of us, that's how we got our start in college speaking, and then actually getting paid where I'm getting $1,000 for an hour, 1,500, 2,000, 3,000.
I'm rich.
I'll pause it there. But and then eventually I was like, man, I want to be a $10,000 like corporate speaker, and that became the dream eventually.
Now, in those early days when you are coming out of this accident, you're interested in speaking. Part of the danger that we both understand, that we try to tell students all the time, is that you can't speak to anybody and everybody about anything. And so, in your type of situation where you go like, I just have this like crazy story that's just relatable to humans. It's, who do I want to speak to? I don't know. I want to speak to people. Men, women, boys, girls, everybody, right? But if we try to market to everybody, you're marketing to nobody. So how did you why college students? And I know it kind of progressed from there, but how did you land on that as kind of a starting point?
For me, it was I look young. I've always looked younger than I am, and so I was in my 20s, and I thought, I can't, I don't think that if I go to Coca-Cola or like some company, right, all their 40, 50, 60-year-old, whether it's salespeople or executives, are going to be like, who is this kid? And so I thought, man, what makes and my nickname, by the way, from when I was on the radio, my days on the radio, was Yo Pal Hal. So it was Yo Pal Hal on the radio. And that was like my persona. I had a Yo Pal Hal logo. I thought, man, it makes sense for me to go either, high schools or colleges. And then after a little research, I realized, colleges have more of a budget for this than high schools do, it seems. Yeah. And so, although, Josh Shipp would have, he crushed it in high school. So that there's that. But yeah, so for me, I was like, this seems like the starting place to cut my teeth is in the college market because I'm young, yo pal Hal, and I think that would be the start. So that's how I started.
And then from there, were you speaking colleges full time for a while? Like, at what point did you start to say, okay, I want to transition to corporate? Because also, this is something we've talked with, you mentioned John Bromo, we've talked with him about, is going from a known speaker in one space to an unknown speaker in another space
Mm,
it's not like a natural transition. It's not like, you think about like, Michael Jordan playing basketball and Michael Jordan playing baseball. It's not like, well, okay, he's good at this, therefore he's good at it. It's like, nah, it doesn't necessarily work. And
sure.
so oftentimes a lot of speakers really struggle making the leap from whatever space into corporate or whatever different space
Yeah.
because it's just a whole new pond that you're swimming in. So what did
Yeah.
that transition look like for you?
So I think part of it is I had always dabbled a little bit in both. And it being that, like Cutco, for example, right? I was speaking to sales reps. Now they were college age because most of Cutco's sales force is they recruit, at colleges. It's mostly a college student sales force. So the age range was the same. But when I was my last year of Cutco, when I knew I wanted to transition and become a speaker, a coach, and an author, I joined BNI. No, I'm sorry. It was actually Latip, I think, back then. There was anyway, but I joined a networking group, right? So like
Mm-hmm.
BNI, Business Networking International, it was like that. I joined a networking group. That way, every week you got to give your little 30-second commercial. And I was practicing saying, hey, I'm a professional speaker. I teach people how to overcome challenges and yada, yada, yada. I was just every week sharpening my, figuring out how to present myself. And then I got booked to speak for Countrywide Home Loans, like a local chapter. But again, now these are people that are twice my age, right?
Yep.
I got $500, which was my first ever paid gig. I was like,
Totally.
I was on top of the world,
This is legit.
and and it went really, really well. They loved it, and so I was able to share my story, my Cutco experience, and then the lessons drawn from both of those, and then that just gave me some confidence, like, oh wow, I can speak to a corporate audience. And so then I started, yeah, I mean, everything. Remember Speaker Match? Remember that
Mm-hmm.
website? I don't know
Yep.
if they're
Yep.
still around, but I used to try to get, I got a couple gigs on there for like a nonprofit and at
Yeah.
$1,500. And I spoke for Boys and Girls Club of America, which was $2,500 at the time, my biggest gig.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so the transition over to college wasn't really difficult, and then to corporate, the way that I did that was when I wrote The Miracle Morning. When I wrote that book, and so I started writing it in 2009, it published in 2012. And during that time, I was, really thoughtful and strategic of like, what do I want this book to do? And one thing I wanted it to do was to get me corporate speaking gigs. I wanted to raise my fee. So throughout that book, I would, tell stories that made it sound like they were all honest, right? But I'm just like, oh, here's a few examples of, companies that I've shared the Miracle Morning with and how they, and it's like, well, those are the only companies that invited me to share the Miracle Morning, but
Yeah.
it sounds like a sampling of hundreds, right? Maybe.
Sure.
Anyway, but I used that book, and I planted seeds throughout the book of me. The Miracle Morning can transform an organization, a school. It's universal for everybody, and it can help companies be more productive, and this and that. And it was a Hail Mary. I didn't know if it was going to work, but sure enough, as the book gets out there and I'm promoting the book, I start getting inquiries to come share the Miracle Morning message with companies, all, you name it, across the board, real estate companies, nonprofits, all over. And when I first got, if somebody reached out, they're like, what do you charge? I think the most I had charged for a college was like $3,500.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, all right, I'll just inch it up. I'm like $5,000. They're like, done. And then what I did is every time I got a fee, I raised it for the next one. So when I quoted the next one, it was 7,500. I quoted the next one, it was 8,500. I quoted the next one, it was either 9,500 or 10. And then I eventually went to 12, 5, and then to 15, and then to 20, and then to 25. Now this is over the course of, years, 5, 6, 7, 8 years that I'm raising the price gradually. And then I'd get to 10. I'd stay there for 6 months or a year and try to get the courage to quote more. And then I did, and then I got it, right? And so I just would, every time I got a fee, I would just gradually raise it. And then now I'm at, 25 or 30,000, I think, plus travel. And eventually along that way too, my buddy goes, hey, do your clients pay you to or pay for first class airfare? I said, no, man, I don't want to, like, I fly Southwest. They're like, dude, your speaking fees at like 10 grand. I think that's the level where they'd pay your first class airfare. And I was like, really? And I was so nervous to quote first class airfare or business
Yeah.
class. And I did. And then I got it. And I was like, whoa, that's so cool. And so, yeah, man, you start, humble beginnings. In fact, last thing I'll say, one of the first college it was a college I spoke at. They didn't have any money. They literally gave me a rock, a smooth rock with the word integrity written on it in Sharpie. And they're like, we wanted to present you with something at our school. Integrity is our foundation. And so we have this rock with the
Wow.
word integrity written on it as a thank you for speaking. And I was like, man, I got a long way to go.
This means a lot to me. We found this in our garden, right outside, right before your speech.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, Now, you mentioned like the book was obviously a big turning point. And outside looking in, seems like that was revolutionary for you. Were you when you were? It sounds like you were doing mostly college speaking, maybe a little bit of corporate stuff. The book was partly a step to get into more corporate type gigs. Were you speaking on Miracle Morning at the time, or is this just something I'm just kind of living? And because oftentimes what happens is speakers are kind of workshopping material, so by the time it reaches book, like I know that this material works and
Yeah.
resonates. So, were you already speaking on Miracle Morning content?
Yeah, so when I started writing, I created the Miracle Morning as my own personal morning routine in 2008 with no intention. I never knew I would share it with anybody, let alone write a book about it or make a speech, right? It was just literally, I was struggling financially. I needed something to turn it around. I assembled the 6 most timeless personal development practices into one ritual and started practicing. Then I taught it to my coaching clients and they're like, well, we're not morning people. I'm like, I know, neither was I. Here's how you beat the snooze button. And
Yeah.
2 weeks later, they're like, oh my gosh, it worked. So what ended up happening, right? So then I tested on my clients, it worked for them. Then somebody asked me to give a speech in town. They heard about me through the networking group. I'm like, hey, can I give a speech on this thing called Miracle Morning? And it was a 15-minute speech. And so I had to figure out how to teach Miracle Morning in 15 minutes, right? And then a guy asked me to be on, this was like before podcasts were a thing. It was like a something hour-long internet radio show. I don't even know.
Yeah.
I'm like, hey, I was literally asking permission. Is it okay if I talk about my morning routine? It's called the Miracle Morning. They're like, sure. So I'm like, and then side note, that 1 hour interview, I said, hey, could I have the audio from that and and use it on my website? I back then, this was 2008. I set up a 1-page landing page. I don't even know. I think I had to learn HTML or something to do
Oh
it.
yeah.
Right. There were no leadpages.net.
Right.
And, but I had learned from Dan Kennedy that the number one asset you have in today's market is your email list. So you need to start growing your email list. One day you will look back and be glad that you started. So I put up this hour-long audio. I made this super ugly homemade web page, and it just had the bullet points like wake up to your full potential, change your life before 8 a.m., become a morning person if you've never been one, right? And over the next 3 years, over 10,000 people just through word of mouth, wasn't running ads, downloaded that audio, listened to that audio, opted in. So when the book came out 3 years later, thank God, right? What is Harvey? Forgot his last name. He says, dig your well before you're thirsty. It's a book title, right? It was like, thank God I started digging my well in 2009. And then 3 years later, I had 10,000 people that I got to email. Hey, the book remember that Miracle Morning audio you listened to 3 years ago? The book is finally out. And they were like, this is amazing. We love that audio. It changed our life. The practice did, on and on. So I forgot your question. I don't know if I answered it.
Well, and I know you've also mentioned before that the book was kind of a slow burn at first. Like it took a minute to really kind of start to build some momentum and build some steam there. But it seemed like from that point that I would assume then as the book built steam that the speaking also really started to take off. So I guess one thing that I think sometimes again misconception that speakers may have is like, oh, if I want speaking gigs, I just need to write a book, and then as if writing a book is just going to magically all of a sudden pop your career. And like again, you're an example of like, yeah, it made a huge difference and continues to make a difference, but that doesn't just magically happen. So for someone who's going like, okay, I'm a speaker, I'm considering writing a book, or I have a book, or I got a book coming out, and I put all this work into it, and I would like to have similar results both to the book, but also to my speaking career. What are some things that you did, or also maybe just kind of properly set expectations of what a book could or couldn't do for your career?
Yeah, most books don't sell very many copies. They don't make you much money, and they don't, right? I mean, so most books don't do that. And I knew that going in, but I self-published the Miracle Morning, right? So I didn't even have a publisher. I was like a one-man show having to get the word out. But I had seen the Miracle Morning. To your point, I was workshopping it. I was teaching it to people through the audio, through speeches, through coaching for 3 years. Plus, I was living it, and it had changed it was constantly changing my life. I was learning, growing, evolving as a result of this daily practice. And so when the book came out, I decided I'm going to commit. My mission is to change 1 million lives one morning at a time, right? And of course, 1 million is an arbitrary number, but it's the biggest number most of us can fathom. And
Yeah.
and then when the book came out, I thought, all right, I'm going to try to do it in 1 year. I'm going to do everything in my power. I'm going to dedicate my life, other than to my children, which were, I had young kids at the time. But my work life is dedicated to somehow, some way, reaching 1 million people this year. And that was, I wrote a follow-up book called The Miracle Equation, but I've lived by this. It's how I broke Cutco records. Like I've always just imagined you just shoot for the biggest thing you could do. You maintain unwavering faith that it's possible. You put forth extraordinary effort. Those are the two decisions of the Miracle Equation: unwavering faith and extraordinary effort. And miracles do happen, right? And you've probably experienced that in your own life and business, Grant.
Sure.
And so I thought, I've done it before with Cutco and with my car accident. I'm going to do it with this book. And so I went out there, and that year I got on 152 podcasts. I didn't pay. That was me emailing 1,000 podcasters to get on 152, right? Or 500 I emailed or whatever, right? It was just law of averages, using my sales experience and doing the best I could, and then asking for referrals every time I did a podcast at the end. And that's how I actually really got going, is I would say, hey, how was today for you? And they're like, oh, you were awesome. I go, hey, do you know a few other, 3 to 5, 10, other podcasters that this would be a great message for their audience? And they'd say, oh, definitely. I go, hey, I'll email you a script, super simple, that you can copy and paste and send to them. And by the way, I did this for speaking clients as well. Every time I got a speech afterwards, I said, how was that? Are you okay if I email you a script to email anybody else you know that might be able to bring in a speaker? Like I learned all that in Cutco, and that's how I turned every speech I turned into 2 or 3. And the same thing with the podcast. But anyway, long story short, at the end of that year, that first year when I committed to do everything in my power to sell 1 million books, I fell short, Grant, by 987,000 copies. Okay? So if you bust your ass and give it everything you have, you might sell 13,000 copies.
Yeah.
And now granted, at the end of that year, I was a little discouraged because I'm like, oh man, I did the math. I go, it's going to take me 76 years at this pace to sell 1 million copies, at which time I'll be 110 years old. Oh, that's a little.
All right, here we go.
I'm like, here we go. But I was a little discouraged, but I'm like, I'm committed for as long as it takes. If it takes me 30 years, I will feel totally fulfilled that I reached 1 million people in 30 years. And it took 6 years. Every year I kept giving it everything I have, working tirelessly, reaching out, social media, interviews, everything, speeches. And 6 years in, I sold 1 million copies. And my speaking calendar was completely dependent on, I didn't do any outbound marketing at all. In fact, I still don't. I've done zero outbound marketing for the last 12 years. I just wrote a book, promoted my speaking in the book, and I do want to give a couple tips on what you need to do to make a book sell a lot of copies in terms of like the content, because that's important. But the point is, all of my energy went into promoting the book.
Yeah.
Because that was the one thing, right? That book, The One Thing by, Jay Papasan and Gary Keller, is like that. But what's the one thing you can do that in doing such, it will make everything else easier or irrelevant? By promoting the book, it sold the speaking engagements, and I didn't have to go then market the speaking in addition. I just had to market the book.
Gotcha. You, as the business has grown, you have speaking, you have the book, you have multiple other books now that have kind of spun off from that. You also do coaching, you've done live events. So you have your hand in a lot of different things. And so I think for, again, a lot of speakers, especially early on, they're going like, I would love to speak and write and coach and podcast and consult and on the list goes. But I mean, we both understand you can't do all those things at once. Something's going to come first, something's going to come last. So what's kind of your thought process on the evolution of your business? Are you still doing as much speaking? Have you cut back on speaking? Where other areas you're increasing and your intention and focus, and why? Like, what's kind of been that evolution for you?
Yeah. So I don't think you have to focus on just one thing, but I think you have to have a primary thing, right? Meaning, for example, in 2005, my last year selling Cutco, the way that I set my goals is I wanted to write my first book, which is a huge undertaking. I wanted to launch my speaking career. So this was before I was a paid speaker. Like that was the year I got my countrywide gig, my first speech. I wanted to I was finishing Cutco, it was my last year with Cutco. So I wanted to find a second business, which ended up becoming coaching. I want to get the best shape of my life, all of these things. However, so I had a goal. I had six big goals. I then defined my mission, which was to double my Cutco sales. And here's why this is so important. If you have multiple goals, which a lot of us do, then what ends up happening is you just make a dent in each one, and you
Mm.
rarely accomplish any single one of them, and because you're always scattering your time. What I recommend doing and what I did that year is I go, okay, I've got six goals that I could say are equally important, but I've got to choose one that becomes my mission. One that is, I'm not allowed to work on the other five until the activity that I committed to for today for this one is complete. So for me, once I've made my sales calls for the day, then I can go work on my book. Then I can go try to figure out and Google how to become a speaker. Then I can go to the gym and get in the best shape of my life. Then I write on and on and on. Then I can figure out what my next venture is going to be. But I had to earn the right to work on the other five goals
Mm.
until by doing the one. So that was in 2005. Fast forward to 2011, 5 years later, I was like, okay, I really want to take my speaking career to the next level. I really want to, my coaching, I want to grow. At that time, I had launched a group coaching program to scale my coaching. I'm like, man, I want to take my group coaching from 200 to 300 members. I want all these things. But again, having learned in 2005, which by the way, in 2005, I reached every single one of the goals. I doubled my income with my speaking career. I wrote my first book. I completed it. I launched my public speaking career. I got in the best shape of my life. But it wouldn't have happened if I would have given all six goals equal weight and equal attention. It was one mission followed by the other five goals. And in 2011, my one mission was write the miracle morning. And when you've done your writing for the day, then you can work on the other goals that you have.
You obviously again kind of touched on this earlier, but you've overcome tremendous obstacles and just had a crazy story. And there are certainly people who are listening, like, man, I've had some crazy stuff that's happened to me too. And again, people that have had nothing that's happened and live a pretty basic life. And in hindsight, you and I can look back on our careers and be like, hey, we wanted to be speakers and we were, and it was awesome. And we made a bunch of money and made a big impact. And look at all these things we've accomplished, yada yada yada. But there's also, like, again, going back to those days of going, like, you and I having the same, and still to this day, we still have the same doubts and insecurities and fears and worries that anybody
Sure.
else has. But when you're wondering, like, I want to be a speaker, I've done some speaking before, but do I have what it takes? Am I good enough? Can I actually do this? I see someone like Hal speaking, or I hear Hal's story, or see someone else on stage, and I just think I will never be as good as them. I will never be able to sell as many books as them. I'll never be able to make the kind of impact that they've made. What would you say to that speaker who's watching, listening, who's just wondering, like, do I even have what it takes to do this?
Yeah. One sentence that y'all should write down. There's always a way when you're committed. That is it. I don't care who you are. I don't care. Right. There is always a way. And it's a universal truth. So there is no, well, oh, that person's better than me. I don't have their charisma. I don't have their skills, their talent, their story, their abilities. We all have those excuses. I've seen the first time I saw John Vroman speak, I got so depressed. I'm like, I suck. He is so much better than me. And I've been doing this for like 10 years. I was so discouraged, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, it's funny, this morning, a video blog popped up on Facebook for me from 15 years ago. I started the Miracle Morning video blog.
Mm.
Grant, I'm watching this morning, cringing. I go, I have no charisma. I have no energy. I'm teaching people basic principles that if I was watching this guy, I'd be like, this guy is sad. Like, this is pathetic, right? Like, I'd like, but I was like, so part of me was like embarrassed. I'm like, God, I hope nobody sees this video. I'm like, I should delete it from Facebook. But I'm like, dude, that just shows that I didn't know I was that bad when I started.
Yeah.
right? And how far I've come. And so, yeah, that's it. That's the answer to your question is there is always a way when you're committed, period. End of story. It's true for every single human being on this planet.
Full stop right there. That's beautiful. Hal, man, we really appreciate you taking a few minutes to share this with us. If people want to find out more about you and check out what you're up to, check out the books, where can we go?
Y'all go to miraclemorning.com. You can download the free Miracle Morning app, which has over 4.9 out of 5 stars. So there is the app. There's a premium and a free version. Of course, the new Miracle Morning updated and expanded edition. I just released this in December. And watch the Miracle Morning movie, totally free. Go to miraclemorning.com. It's a really inspiring documentary that features some famous people that you will recognize and how they start their day. So miraclemorning.com is the home for the app, the book, and the movie.
Awesome. Hal, thanks for the time, man. We appreciate it.
Appreciate you, Grant.